I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome to the podcast today Wendy J. Turner. Dr. Turner holds a PhD from UCLA and is a professor of history in the Department of History, Anthropology, and Philosophy in the Pamplin College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Augusta University. She is the director of the Graduate Certificate in Bioethics and director of Interdisciplinary Studies in the Graduate School. The main focus of her research is the intersection between law and medicine in medieval England, with special attention given to mental health, learning disabilities, and intelligence. Well published, she has worked on the topics of premodern trauma, disabilities, science, law, and medicine. Her most recent publication is Investigating the Lifecycle of the Medieval English Soldier, Disability, Mental Trauma, and Medicine in Connection with War in Late Medieval English Records, in Disability and War in the Late Middle Ages, Becoming, Surviving, Managing, edited by Dubourg and Masson, released with Leeds Humanities Press, 2025. Turner is the recipient of several honors, including the Leverhulme Trust, visiting professorship to Swansea University in Wales. Welcome, Dr. Turner. It is such a pleasure to have you here, not least of which because you were there with me in Dublin when I started this podcast. You and I have been friends for years, and your work on medieval military history, literature, law, medicine, everything wrapped into a nice interdisciplinary bundle. You are one of the groundbreaking scholars on medieval mental health, one of the groundbreaking scholars on intersections of law, medicine, and history. And so welcome, welcome, welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I mean, there's so much that we have to talk about. But first, I would like to know more about your most recent publication and your current research. Can you explain for the audience more about what it is you're doing right now?
So the most recent one that you read the long title of, and I apologize, it was so long.
Okay.
It was really started out with me interested in whether or not soldiers that had disabling injuries could retire. And which sounds like, well, of course they could to a modern ear. But
Right.
in the Middle Ages, there wasn't quite a thing called retirement. They were at times able to find ways around going back to work. And I know it sounds simple, but obvious. If you can't work, how do you support yourself? And so in the Middle Ages, you had to find a way to make supporting yourself possible without the work. And some of them that were injured badly enough found alms from the church. Even some of them had a position called a corrody, which was sort of a handout, kind of like a retirement, but it was a gift either from a lord or the crown or the church, in which it was often given in cash, so then they could pay for a small room in the town and maybe even subsistence and even at times, if the corrody was large enough, for an assistant. So they had somebody to go do their shopping for them and maybe even help them get dressed or get up and down, depending on what their injury was. Um, and that got expanded and expanded and expanded until I began to look at injury of all soldiers, even people who weren't quite soldiers yet, who were children that were training to be in that position. And some of their injuries, even from wooden staves, broken arms, you could see kids get carried away and end up injured even on the practice field. And I looked at people that recovered even on the battlefield and what surgeons did. I looked at different medications, other things that happened that could assist them in making it home. Um, And even in other work that I've done, I've looked at injury during a period of ransom in which they were basically a captive somewhere else and being beaten up or something. Um, Horrible things did happen. There was mischief. Was mischief and mayhem.
Well, now
Um,
I want to just stop you there for 1 second to kind of give a better picture of military organizations in the Middle Ages. We think about modern militaries, we think about modern standing armies, we think about the question of militias, but medieval armies were not standing armies per se. And so soldiers as a profession, was there really a profession as soldier? And how does that vary? Do you know? I mean, medieval Europe, medieval England is different than France, but the structure is kind of the same, isn't it?
sure. I mean, there are some that made soldiering their profession. They were called mercenaries, and they were soldiers for hire, and they went from battle to battle to battle. And they would basically fight for whatever side would pay them the best
Right?
because that was their chosen path in life. I'm avoiding the word profession, but their chosen profession. It's not quite that, but it's what
Their
they
chosen
decided.
occupation. Their chosen
There we go.
occupation.
Occupation.
Occupation, yes. Well, and this is because, of course, in times of war, especially in England, individual nobles would call up their local people, their local men. So, in a lot of respects, military warfare operated more on a militia basis than on the standing army basis. But then, of
Yeah.
course, that varies as we go through the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages in terms of you go from war bands, where everybody is a warrior to an extent, and then you have everybody who's not, to okay, you're going to call people up at times when you need them for either defense or in some cases offense.
Right.
So when you're talking about the retiring soldier, are you talking about the later Middle Ages in England? What period of time are you talking about?
So I was mostly looking from about 1250 to 1450, maybe even 1500. But most of what I was looking at is that 14th century period. And certainly I've seen plenty in the 13th century as well. But that period generally you see more of this idea of recovery so I can get back on the horse or back to my bow or whatever. Some people, though, couldn't recover. I mean, if you have had lost your fingers or your hand, you can't pull a bow. You won't have the strength any longer. Yeah, you got to have those fingers.
You
Um,
do.
and um, and you have to have the strength. So if your arm is broken again and again and again, or if you have, musculature uh, sliced through the muscle and it can't recover fully, if you can't extend your arm, you can't pull the bow either.
Right.
So you have to be, if your arm is locked here, that's not a lot of
Of movement for it. Yeah.
movement, you're not going to be able to draw. So it depended on what your position was in the military, clearly. It also depended on who was your superior officer. It also depended on your rank in society.
Right.
And so certainly those people who had more money, they could just go home and they got the
Yep.
best care.
Right.
They could hire their own doctor. They could do whatever they needed to do, right?
No, no parallels to the modern world at this moment at all. None.
No, none at all. I haven't seen any
No.
parallel. Um, we're being completely facetious because there are definitely parallels to the rich were rich and they were extremely rich in the Middle Ages. Um, you know, multi-billionaires compared to what we're
Everybody
thinking.
else. Yeah.
And everyone else is sort of middle class, even though they didn't have a class structure, but they
Right.
had, societal, levels or statuses or something. Um, and most of the fighters are going to be in that middle echelon of society. There were even some peasants that went to battle, but not too many. But there certainly were a fair share of those people, depending on how you define peasant. But
Yeah.
the lowest part of the society.
Well, and that actually raises a very important question. And because you are a historian, you are an exceptionally good person to answer this.
Amy.
Yes, well, particularly in recent scholarship, in more recent scholarship, a lot of people have pushed back against the traditional designation of the feudal system. It's what everybody expects. It's what everybody thinks of it. When I ask my students, when you hear medieval, what comes to mind? They go feudal system, but it isn't really a thing. Can you explain, A, why it's not really a thing, and particularly why we've kind of moved away from that designation?
Well, okay, so let's explain the thing first.
Yes, please.
So, if you take a very strict look at what feudalism is, it's one extremely wealthy person taking a vow to another extremely wealthy person of fealty. That means they're going to be loyal, they're going to come if the person calls, they're going to get something in return, and that is protection. But that means protection in a big sense of that word, meaning food, clothing, and shelter, land, and servants.
It's an oath of fealty. It's an oath of service.
Yes, it's an oath of service. And so, if you've ever seen, Bibles or other things that have this symbol on them, this is the symbol of the oath of fealty. So you put your hands together like that, and the person that's in the superior position would put their hands around your hands, accepting that oath of fealty. And so when modern, even, from the Victorian period forward, if you pray, you're supposed to be thinking of God's hands around your hands, accepting that oath of fealty, of faithfulness to God. And that comes directly from, if you look at ancient pictures of prayer, prayer is like this, or like this, or like this. There are other postures of prayer that are depicted, but this is the oath of fealty. So you are then taking an oath to this person who's above you. Where feudalism goes wrong is that people began to spin away from just that little exchange,
Right.
of I'm going to give you land and, sometimes, some money to get started, but land and riches in exchange for you coming to help me fight a battle whenever I want you to. And I will do that, that exchange. I'm going to give you land. You come anytime I call. That is the oath of fealty. And that led to various theorists talking about feudalism. And feudalism meaning that the whole system was wrapped together, that the manorial system, the manor that the Lord lived on, and his Lord, those two were, in a big picture, the way society was organized. And so, the manner, that all the peasants took oaths of fealty to the Lord, that never happens. Um, they might take an oath in a court, in a manor court, that they haven't done something, or that they did or didn't do, whatever they're in court for. But that's a different thing. They don't take an oath of fealty.
Right.
There's no feudal obligation there between the Lord and the and the people working his land
And so
or his.
the idea of feudalism that has been passed down to generic audiences since the 19th century is this rigid structure that is supposed to be top down, king on top, then the next level of vassals, then the next level of vassals, all the way down to the serfs. And the problem is that yes, there might have been a social structure, but nobody was swearing oaths past a certain point. And then, of course, you've got the merchant class that is completely outside of any kind of system of fealty that's based on the manorial system. I mean, you've got the manorial system over here, and you've got the merchants doing something else altogether, correct?
Well, and they, in the Middle Ages, to give this just a teeny bit of oomph, is that they were considered peasants. And so when they, and this is a medieval thing, talked about the bellatores, those who
Right.
fight,
Fought the
and
wars. Yeah.
and those who laboratores,
Those who
those
labored.
who
Yes.
work, that labor, they included all of those people that you're, saying, oh, well, over here. But if we really look at the Middle Ages, you're right. It's not just those who pray, those who fight, those who work. Those three big, struck the way the medieval people thought about their society was broken into three. It's really broken into about 15. And in all the different places. So in France, it's sort of a feudal structure because the only the top people took a vow to the crown, and then the people below that took vows to whoever and they could
Right.
have cross vows. They could have take vows to different people at different levels, but then there's no vow below the
Right.
gentry,
Well, and
really.
an important thing to point out in terms of that is that France, as we know it, as a unified country, was not a unified country until until about the 14th-ish century, because there's so many areas of territory where the French king had the Ile de Cité and his immediate areas
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
counties, and he had to rely on all of the dukes and the barons and the counts of all the other territories to swear fealty to him, only so he could have a collection and a coalition of nobles and land, because otherwise the French king didn't own an awful lot of his own. That becomes the issue in the 12th century with Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Well, and it becomes a big issue. That's why Parlement in France becomes weaker and weaker and weaker because the king has no power.
Right.
Whereas in England, when they set up the feudal system under William the Conqueror, the Bastard,
William the Bastard.
Conqueror.
William the Bastard. William the First, but William the Bastard,
He
yes.
was known as the Bastard
He
during his
was.
lifetime.
He was.
Um,
And he was pretty much one. That's fair.
and yeah, he was. Well, anyway, he decided, no, we're not going to have this kind of a feudal system. The fealty system, everyone will swear their very first oath to me.
Right.
And so he basically says, all the land is mine, every inch of it, and I am going to parcel it out as I see fit. And if I don't like you, I'll take it back. And then, so it ends up to be a different kind of structure in England. But let's just take that, ad infinitum. It is completely different in all of the Germanies.
The German principalities.
Many,
Yes.
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 And it's nowhere to be seen in Spain. It's um and while they have their
Iceland is an autonomous collective in the Monty Python sense of the word, because they don't have a
right,
king until the 13th century, when they come under control of Norway by the point of a sword, partly because they couldn't get their own shit together. Yeah.
we could say the same about Poland.
Yeah.
The Polish people, had one of the very first democracies. We completely failed. Um, but who's counting? Italy? No, not to be found. They
And
are principalities again. It's
And
tiny little city-states.
The Scandinavian countries had individual kingships and kingdoms
Right.
depending on who was the stronger, who was not. Yeah. So medieval Europe, it is impossible to create a blanket terminology for social structure in the Middle Ages. And let's not even talk about the fact that the Middle Ages existed in the rest of the world too. But in medieval Europe, we have this impression of the feudal system, and it's not really a system, it's not really a thing.
It's not really a thing. No.
Yeah.
And it's there is this oath of fealty that happens between various people, but it's really between this guy and this guy, or this guy and this guy. We can kind of point to who took oaths to what, who, when. And other than that, no.
Well,
So,
it's like explaining that chivalry, the
oh
idea
yeah.
of chivalry, and of course my students always want to talk about the code of chivalry. There isn't. There are people who wrote their interpretation of what they thought should be a code by which knights behaved, but it was not an established, universally accepted concept. And of course, chivalry comes from chevalier, which is guy who sits on a horse. And the
So,
idea of
yeah.
courtly love, of course, was invented by Marie de France. Sorry, not Marie de France. The idea of courtly love was invented by Eleanor Aquitaine and Marie
Thank
de
you.
Champagne, her daughter. And they invented it as a means of, hi, y'all don't treat women particularly well. So let's rethink this and consider an idea of courtliness and courtly love where you might actually pay some respect to the women of the court, maybe. And courtly love and chivalry get conflated in the 12th century. But you have military orders that have their own idea of honor, loyalty, fidelity. Sir Gawain the Green Knight says that the knightly values are fidelity, courtesy, chastity, piety, and generosity. Lovely, wonderful, but it wasn't necessarily something that was codified and applied to everybody who sat on a horse or fought a war. So when you're talking about soldiers, you're not talking just about the guys on the horses, the knights. You're talking about all of the people who may have fought a war. And of course, the knights would have been the people who may or may not have money to retire on, correct?
Right. And so the richer you were, the easier it was to get a doctor, and the easier it was to, have servants take care of you. It's really the people a couple steps down from that that I was concerned with, partly because those people show up in the administrative records. And so I am, sort of limited by who I can find. And I don't want to just have, I mean, it's one thing to have, I do have a few sort of blanket statements that come out of the Tree of Battles, or, some of these ideas around how you're supposed to behave in a battle, and before, during, and after a battle,
Yes.
um, as a soldier.
Right. Because
But
there have been rules of warfare for centuries. There have been rules about what you do and
right,
do not do to civilians in warfare. There have been rules about what you do to prisoners of war in warfare for centuries.
for
There have been
centuries.
prohibitions against killing unarmed people who are potentially surrendering for centuries. Just saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could just ask a historian. Right.
Or you could open a bloody book. But yes, there is that.
Um, but when you're looking at the who gets help, some of those people who are fighting, either because they're mercenaries, they're going to be in big trouble because they're paying their own way.
Right.
And so, unless they get alms from the church, they're probably not going to get any assistance. But if you're looking at somebody who is there on the king's behalf, whether it's a tier or two down, and it's one of those lords who called in all of his people, I needed so many men, you're going, and let's go. Um, then if you get injured in battle, that person might extend a courtesy to you. And so often when a lord was adding on to a church or endowing a church with some money, as part of the deal, yeah, it's a deal. It's not just me giving the church money. It's like, I'm going to give the church money, but only if you pray for me once I die for at least 50 years.
Yes.
And,
But look
and they
at
had,
purgatory, which is why
right?
purgatory had to be a thing thanks to the Fourth Lateran Council, because purgatory wasn't
Um,
a thing before that.
but I also might want to put in, 4 or 5 Cordies. I might use those for some of my family, my sister who never got married, or my, younger brother who, is doing quite well, but he's not rich like me.
Right.
And so he might have 4 or 5 of those. And if this guy doesn't look like he's going to live very long, he might go ahead and gift him one of those Corrides, knowing, okay, he's lost his leg. He's not going to be able to work now. He's not looking too good. Let's just give him a Cordy. It makes me look great.
It is an idea of transactional charity where it's like, I'm happy
Yes.
to support you because I look amazing. I'm sure some people were altruistic. Some people probably thought of, let's actually help the poor. But in terms of social networks and social structures in the Middle Ages, depending on where you were, there was no safety net
No.
necessarily. And the church itself did not even always operate as a safety net because, they might give money and alms and have almshouses, but not necessarily for everybody, I would imagine.
No, no, not for everybody. But certainly they knew that these soldiers, or mercenaries even, were helping defend them. And they were out there, putting their life on the line. And if they could help them, they did. And so you see a lot of soldiers or soldiers' wives on the getting cordies, or at least some kind of an alms handout that's on a regular paid schedule. Sorry. Um, and so if you go and look at the hospital records that are handing them out on a regular basis, usually quarterly per year, they didn't give it to you all at once. They would come and check on you, but they also would then had a ledger in which they kept track of how much they paid you per, every many months. Sometimes it was twice a year, but often it was quarterly. But I looked at other things too, as well as those types of things. I was also looking at apparatuses that people used, and
Prosthetics was like prosthetics, if
they
they needed,
did.
legs or arms,
Prosthesis is
hands.
certainly one of those things, but also walking aids. Sometimes people just use typical crutches and whatnot, but they might have a cane, they might have other things, but even walkers. I mean, it was not an unheard of thing to have a walker um, to hold you up or help you balance. But some people went as far as to have carts, some kind of wheeled vehicle
A
in
little
which
wheeled platform in some cases.
sometimes hand trestles, little things to protect your hands if you needed to crawl across the floor. But sometimes they had something like a wheelbarrow with a hired guy that would help move you around through town, so you could get your work done, or get around, even just to go into town to collect the alms, handouts from the poor, from people giving to the poor. um, and sometimes that was just to pay for the handler,
Right?
because
Right.
he had to earn a wage too, right?
Well, but an interesting point of that is that depending on the medieval society we're talking about, people with physical disabilities could still function in society. They were not simply cast off
Oh yeah.
as useless. They were actually recognized and in some cases still very valued members of communities because a community relies on everybody. And if somebody goes to war, is injured, suffers a disability, and comes back and they were somebody who who worked with their hands and their hands are still fine, they can still work, and so they
Yeah.
are still seen as a valued member of that community. Yes.
Yes. So let me tell you a couple of stories.
Please.
There was a German knight, so horse, right? Who was injured in battle, could no longer use his legs. I'm sure his something happened to his spine or something.
Right.
And his legs became useless. And so he had a metal worker, because he's a knight, he has a lot of money. He had a metal worker make a harness that had big legs on it, so he could fit his legs inside and still ride his horse and go to battle. And he went to several battles like that. Um, leg, it's not working. Like, he is strapped in there. If they had cut the horse down, he
That would
would
have
have
been
been
the end
on
of
the
it.
ground.
Yeah.
Um, and so he went to several battles like that, and became quite famous for, doing that. But he wanted to die in battle, very macho. There are other people. Okay, so let me say a couple of things here. One is, if you had a head injury and you could no longer do your job because of the head injury, if you were rich, you were out of job completely. There would be nothing for you to do because your job is thinking. And so if you can't fulfill that responsibility, the crown or your lord would then assign you a guardian to watch over your, you know, lands and goods. You would still be cared for in a very posh way, but you would not be able to do your job. But if you were a peasant and you had a head injury, there are other things peasants can do. You can still, if you can function and you have enough mental awareness, you could help with planting, you could help with the harvest, and many people with head injuries did. Um, Now, some people developed things much like we do today. We see in patients today, depending on where your head was injured and how it was injured, um, they might have a change in personality, and that might become an issue with not knowing boundaries anymore. Um,
Traumatic brain
Maybe,
injuries that of all
uh,
kinds. Yeah.
yeah, it might be that you're acting out in public, you are not dressed appropriately, something along that line. And so you might need to have somebody, a handler, and they call them keepers. And so this keeper then would basically was assigned to walk beside you, and make sure that you stay out of trouble. Um, but that doesn't mean that you're useless.
Right.
They still would have you do whatever you could do, because one more pea in the ground is more pea plants.
Right.
So,
Well,
right?
I mean, what that essentially says, though, is that medieval people, in some ways that some modern societies and some ways that other modern societies have not, medieval people understood the viability and the productivity did not cease simply because you were injured. And if you could still contribute, let's have you contribute and let's facilitate your contribution. Let's have a keeper. Let's
Right.
find a way for you to still participate in society one way or another. And I mean, that is something, of course, that modern society, in some societies they do very well, and in others they do not.
True. Definitely. And I'd say the late 20th century is a good example of that, where a lot of people with mental health troubles, whether it was through an injury in battle or some other injury, were often just shut away into an institution. And they were not contributing, but they also lost their sense of purpose. And so it's actually very contemporary now to see more and more people dealt with either through the justice system in a friendlier fashion, because they have a mental health issue. Doesn't mean that they, or PTSD or um, some other head injury, which is an actual injury, not just a mental health issue. Um, but they then can reintegrate into society and are often, they go to counseling, they have therapy. And the keeper was kind of fulfilling that role, right?
Right.
let's go plant today. I can see this happening. Let's
Right.
go this
Let's
way.
go. We have
Here's
these
a,
things to do. Yeah.
here's your sack of beans. Now you do what I'm doing. It's in some
Right.
ways it was somebody walking aside beside you.
Right.
Um, in the church, if someone developed, something akin to Alzheimer or dementia or something, there were rules in the church that people with mental health disabilities could not enter church service. But once in, if you developed something,
They would look
then
after you.
they looked after you, but they also had someone called a coadjutor. That person would walk beside you, much like a keeper in society, that would then help you to make sure that you did what you were supposed to be doing. And when you could no longer do those things, the church was really good about helping their people with retirement.
And I would imagine monasteries and priories, of course, in some cases, they might become variations of retirement homes for some of the older clerics and clergy who might no longer be able to serve at mass, who can't hear confession anymore, who can't
Right.
function the way that they needed to. But then, of course, the church did not just abandon them. But you couldn't
No,
just say, okay, my uncle came back, he's got a traumatic brain injury, let's stick him in the church. Let's put him in a monastery. It didn't work that way.
it doesn't work that
No,
way.
because you have
No.
to be able to take vows, and and if you're
Yeah.
going to the monastery or into any religious order, you have to be competent mentally to take those vows because you can't be coerced into taking them either. And I think that's something that a lot of modern people don't really think about when it comes to, well, what did you do with these people? Or even monastic circumstances and setups. It's interesting because what you said about the early 20th century is that when a lot of people think about medieval to now, they assume that it's, well, the Middle Ages was primitive, the Middle Ages was backwards, and we have progressed. And one of the things that I constantly say with so many of my guests is that actually the Middle Ages had a very nuanced and sophisticated way of seeing many of these things. And where we fall down is in the 19th century. We start to decline in the 18th and 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century in America and in England, you've got doctors who are prescribing a rest cure for women where they're telling them, you're too hysterical, you need to do nothing because that'll help. And it's not even just take some time off and take some rest. It's do nothing, which is why we have the short story, the yellow wallpaper, because you try
Oh,
doing nothing. The idea that you cannot stimulate your brain by reading, conversation, anything. So if anything, in the Middle Ages, they developed process, practice, and different modes of helping and enabling the continued contribution to society. And we fall away from that in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then we have to get back to it. Is that a fair assessment?
well, there is in the 17th and 18th century something called the work movement, in which there were institutions where if you had had some mental health issues or even other issues, you could go and they would teach you an occupation. And so if you had, a intellectual disability in particular, they had special institutions in which you would learn to do laundry or you would learn to make clothes. Um, so I don't want to short shrift those studies. Um, but yes, at the same time, there are definitely cracks to be seen from the 18th century forward as society industrializes. And so it's the rise of industrialization that shifts the way we look at both the disabled in society, physically and mentally, but also mental health generally. We look at those issues quite differently from the industrial world forward. And it's only now that we are starting to say, oh, maybe that wasn't a good idea.
Right? Maybe we screwed that one up. Well, and of course, this becomes one of the issues whenever we talk about anything medieval is what records do we have? So when you talk about mental illness, mental health issues, and you talk about, I mean, head injuries, we know that there are surgical manuals that talk about treating head injuries. We know from osteoarchaeology that people survived head injuries, healed, went back into battle, and might be killed another way. We have those skeletal remains. We have that evidence. But how do you find references to mental health in the medieval records? How do they discuss it in medieval records?
So I am looking mostly at legal and administrative records because I wanted to look at real people. But that is not the only place to find terms or work on mental health in the Middle Ages. It's certainly been a thing. It was in Roman law as well, so it's from antiquity, even probably earlier. It has been a thing. Like we know that some people don't think like everyone else,
Right.
and that doesn't just mean a mental health problem that you or I might have, but serious intellectual disabilities as well. And so they have gradations just like we do. Um, and they run the gamut from very serious conditions of not being able to function. Like the bodily functions are working, but they cannot speak, they cannot, they don't know where they are, they can't get dressed, they can't function at all. To people that have mild cognitive disorders, to, not being able to remember, which is a big part of the medieval world when you're a completely illiterate society. Well, not completely, but 90% of the population cannot read. And so if that's true, then maybe it's 80% toward the end of the Middle Ages, but still 80% of the population cannot read. So they rely on their memory. And so memory becomes a huge uh, marker for mental health. Can they remember how to do certain things, how to make change? How much is this coin worth? Um, and surprisingly, one of the big tests, much like we do today, if you're in a car accident, people say, oh my gosh, you hit your head, you
What
know,
date is it? What's the date? Who's the president?
what's the date? Who's the president? Oh, how many fingers am I holding up? They do exactly the same. Like, how many fingers am I holding up? Who is the king? What day is this? How many children do you have? Can you measure cloth?
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that one shows up again and again. And clearly, it must be something they all knew how to do. Like,
Even if that
can
was
you?
not their even if that was not their occupation, it was something people knew how to do. Okay.
Because they ask everyone, like, can you measure cloth? And can you? So it's not a male-female thing. They ask everyone, can
So
you
when you
measure
when you're
cloth?
looking at these records, you're looking at the questions being asked of people in legal proceedings in order to determine their competence.
I am. But I'm also looking at the terminology they're using to describe this person. And it wasn't always one thing. It's not like, oh, they have this problem and this problem. It's often a description. He has no sense of himself. It's a it's a description of what's wrong.
Right.
Um, he has no memory for the important things such as family, measuring cloth, and this, but he does know, you know, uh, that he likes silver more than copper coins, or something
Yeah,
along that
something
line.
lines.
Um, he knows that this is a vase, and he knows to call it a vase, but he doesn't realize that glass will break, and he just dropped it on the floor.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And so all of these kind of examinations are in the context of legal competence, or are they in terms of care and providing for people?
It's both.
Okay.
So they're looking for legal competence. And I think earlier we talked about whether or not people could take a vow to the church. That was true of all vows, including marriage vows and whether or not you could make a contract, a vow of a contract. Because remember, it's oral
Yeah.
society.
And
So
you have to be competent to make sure that nobody's manipulating you, to make sure that you're taking these vows
right,
fully and freely. And that's what a lot of modern people don't
right,
get, is that when medieval people made oaths, when they took vows, they had to be given freely and competent, so they weren't being forced into something. And
right,
people are like, "Oh, well, people were forced into marriage all the time." No, you couldn't really be forced. You could be pressured by political alliances, you could be pressured by
your
family,
parents.
your parents, and you may have a hard time making a decision that you actually want, but you have to
Right.
be competent to swear those oaths and make those vows.
You have to be. And you have to be, in the same way, you have to be competent if you're going to buy and sell property or movable goods or anything. And so that's why you needed a keeper. Because if you can't buy and sell, you can't go buy food. You can't,
Right? You
I
can't
mean,
function in the
you
economy.
can't function.
Yeah.
Um, so it's interesting because in the Middle Ages, and I mean just about everyone, understood the brain to work a particular way.
Mhm.
You like this.
Okay.
So they thought of all the senses coming into your brain through your face. And that makes logical sense, right? So smell and sight, taste, but also touch. They thought all the touch things
Um,
went up to your face and then entered the front of your brain. But they also thought of common sense as being a sense. And
okay.
so your ability to distinguish or just discern things that are around you, like distance and all those things, all of that is a sense, and it all came in through the front of your brain. And then it would go to the middle part of your brain where you would think about it. And they actually thought about it as a like a cog, a wheel turning around and like a machine.
Oh,
It's tick, tick,
wow.
tick, tick,
Okay.
tick, tick, moving around in the middle part of your head. Um, and you would cogitate, that cognition thing about what am I seeing and what am I, oh, it's Larissa Tracy, and I'm looking at it on a computer, and
Yeah, all the wheels are turning and fitting together.
right? And
Yeah.
in the very back was, as things progress through your head, then you would remember, oh, I'm going to remember this. But you could also, there was a string that went through the little cogs that went around so that you could remember, oh, I remember her. We were in Ireland together. And so then you would have the whole mechanism, and they would talk about people, as they grow old, they grow rusty.
Ah, because the cogs don't turn smoothly. But that
They
also is probably where we get the phrase, keep that in the back of your mind,
Right?
right?
You can, and there's a whole list of those that I didn't realize all come from that late medieval period when they are really starting to look at machines in a new way.
Right.
And they have clock towers and, all of those types of things. The first clocks come into existence, the
15th
first
century.
eyeglasses
Yeah.
come into existence. All of those mechanical things come to the fore. And that's when they start talking about the brain as working like a machine,
As machinery, and
a
machinery that gets
well-oiled
rusty, it needs to be
machine.
a well-oiled machine. That's fascinating. I didn't realize that, because I mean, I know I took, when I was at Trinity, I took a class with Professor John Scattergood, who was my supervisor for my dissertation, and it was maps, clocks, and Renaissance literature, and we talked about the first
Oh,
appearance
I love it.
of mechanical clocks in the late Middle Ages, in the 15th century predominantly, and the first discovery of the cog and wheel system, and then how it shows up in literature, and how that affects the way that different authors talk about things, like Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare is one of
Right.
the first references to a mechanical clock in
Yeah.
his plays. And when those things become common enough to make their way into literature, then obviously they're making their way into medical manuals and in legal documents about whether or not your brain is functioning like a well-oiled clock, or whether it's functioning rusty, or whether your cogs aren't turning, and whether the hamsters have kicked over and died. Sorry, that's my own. That's what I say to my students. I can hear the little wheels, the hamsters,
Yeah.
and they just turned over and died. That's this
Oh,
semester.
that would be bad.
At this point in the semester, all my students' hamsters are dead in their brains. But so when you're looking for the language of other forms of trauma, other forms of mental health, what terminology comes up in terms of the way people behave and other things that we might recognize now as mental health disorders?
Well, it's all written in Latin, so I'm sorry.
Okay.
Um, or Greek,
Yeah.
one of the two. But there are terms that, slowly over time, each generation or every couple of generations, we get rid of certain terms because those terms become offensive, we'll just say.
Yeah.
And and so even as a child, people would say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you can't understand that mathematical problem. What an idiot." And idiota in Latin was one of those mental health conditions. And idiota was someone who could function, but not highly. And so they had low intellectual ability, but could get dressed and maybe understand certain things and maybe even had a job like helping with planting or something like that, a farming type job, but certainly couldn't be a lord. That there was not enough
Mental
mental
acuity.
acumen. Yeah,
Yeah.
that it's just not there. Um, but that would be one term that, has gone through many emendations in the mental health world again and again and again until, now we might say an intellectual disability. Um, but that's only because, and I'm sure that will become, something we don't say anymore in 50, 100 years from now. Because every, generation, or I'd say every 4 or 5, we need to ditch the old terms and we talk about it in new ways. Um, Even when I started writing, we were using the terminology of learning disability, and we don't say that now. We say intellectual disability. And so it does shift over time and depending on what it is. There is the term dementia. It is not the same as what we call dementia today. It is one extreme piece of what we call dementia today. Dementia today is more of an umbrella term.
Yeah, it's like saying something's purple. That can be a whole bunch of different things.
That's a whole different bunch of different
Yes.
things, including Alzheimer's, which
Right.
is one form of dementia. There's vascular dementia. There's all kinds of dementia. But in the Middle Ages, dementia was only the extreme and often violent form of that condition.
It's the same root
And
word as demented. If somebody is demented, it's not that they've lost their memory or their cognitive ability. It's that they've gone off the rails, that they've lost their shit, basically.
yeah,
That's the clinical term for it, losing your shit.
right. I remember there was oh, maybe I shouldn't admit how old I am, but
Fine. It's fine.
I know Dr. Demento. Do you remember that?
I
That was
remember Dr. Demento, and
okay. All
I
right.
do.
Well, so that he's playing on that word. That
Yeah.
word demented. Like we're gonna have a show, it's gonna be crazy. He was on the radio for those of you who don't know. Anyway, but that's it, he was a radio personality, like Dr. Tracy is a YouTube personality, right? And so, your social media phenomenon, that's what he was, but back in before we had social media.
Right.
Um,
And it was a persona,
But
and it was a persona that was based on being off the cuff,
I'm going to be
I'm
cool and
I'm a bit out there, and I won't
right.
say crazy because again, but just outrageous, and he would do
Right?
weird and outrageous and unusual things,
Precisely.
yeah, and so the idea was more demented than dementia, but they come from the same root word in
They
Latin.
do. They do. And that was my point is that I think words take on a life of their own and dementia today is still used and I think in a very kind way, but dementia in the Middle Ages was not something you wanted. Um, and you might even lock someone up because, meaning, especially if they had become violent, they might spend some jail time.
Right.
Um, Often waiting for their pardon, but then they had to be remanded into the hands of family or a custodian who was, would probably keep a pretty tight
Rain on them.
control over them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we have instances in history, in medieval history, that go all the way up through to modern history, where, say, for instance, somebody may have developed a physical illness that then affects their brain. And I mean, you
Yeah.
look at Henry VIII, and is that tertiary stage neurosyphilis? Possibly. Is it some kind of vascular dementia? Maybe. Is it residual trauma from the
Yeah.
jousting accident? And where is that mental capacity as he starts to get paranoid? He gets delusional. He starts hacking off the heads of 80-year-old women who are no threat to him because he's seeing enemies everywhere. We can look at some of those and say, okay, these are the possibilities. But in some respects, is there a danger in trying to apply modern diagnoses to historical figures?
Oh, definitely. And so I usually try to look at, and that's why I'm being really cautious with explaining each of these words. And
Yes.
these are only the ones that I think modern listeners are going to identify with. But certainly we still use the term non compos mentis in
Yes.
law. Um, but there are plenty of other terms like furiosus or fatuitas or, you know, lunaticus. A lunatic is not the same as lunaticus. Just to say that we can't really apply what we think of those in terms of those words today to the past. And I can't really find an equate, I can't put an equal sign and say, non cosmentis means that you have X in the DSM-4, 5. Um, but I can tell you, and I have explained this in several publications, that there are parallels, much like dementia. I can say it looks something like the extreme end of what we might call dementia today, like in the very last year. But notice all those qualifiers. It
Right.
sort of looks.
Right.
It
Kind of.
maybe. That's
Maybe. It's
right,
possible.
right,
It's potentially, yes.
right.
Okay, but now
Because
you're going to have to
I'm,
explain the difference, though, between lunaticus and lunatic, because, of course, people think lunatic, somebody driven mad by the forces of the moon.
I
Uh,
know.
so explain.
Well, here I'm going to use one of these like words.
Right.
So lunaticus is something like, but not quite the same as bipolar disorder.
Oh, okay. Which
So
in itself is a
they
difficult diagnosis.
phase.
They what?
So I will say that they phase. They
They
phase in
say.
and out.
Okay.
And so they have times, they will say periods, they're periodic. So they have times in which they're perfectly lucid, they're fine, and then there are times in which they are not fine. And they often correlated the thing. And so it becomes conflated with this, sort of mana or month disease or, every month they're
Mania.
doing
Yeah.
strange things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and
Um,
even in the modern diagnosis of bipolar disorder, I mean, previously referred to as manic depressive, and that's not even an accurate reference to it. And, there are many people who
uh,
have been misdiagnosed as manic depressive slash bipolar. And there are many people who have been misdiagnosed as depressive who probably had bipolar. I mean, it's a difficult thing even now when we have at least some better understanding of brain chemistry,
right.
because it's difficult to pinpoint these things as it is. But I wasn't aware that lunatica.
Well, and you bring up a good point. So
Yeah,
there's right. So there's no way for me to go back and look at the brain chemistry or diagnose or discuss any of these things with any of these people. So there's no way, absolutely zero way to go and actually find out what they had. All we have is really a scant evidence
right,
of what the terms were and sort of some of the actions, like he has no sense of himself
right.
as being a description that might go with this term. And even then, are they using the description to describe something beyond the term, or are they? So it's I would say, after 20 years of looking at these records, um, maybe more, um, that there is a spectrum, and certainly some people were considered harmless, and some people were considered dangerous, um, and that on that spectrum um, would not fall many of the mental health conditions that you or I might talk about today because they just didn't come up.
And they didn't have the
And
terminology to identify them or
yeah,
to deal with them. So,
there are
but that
people,
doesn't mean that, of course, they didn't exist. They just weren't necessarily discussed in any clear, identifiable terms that we can now
right.
look and say, okay, they suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, or our modern medical diagnoses. In some respects, those are just terms they didn't have, and it doesn't mean they didn't exist. Doesn't mean those things didn't happen. But in some ways, it's very difficult to say, oh yeah, that was their problem. That was Richard the Third's problem.
Yeah,
Not Richard the
no,
Second's problem or anything like that.
right, right.
Yeah,
So one of the things that I have found with these soldiers is that some of them do come back with some sort of trauma. And while they're trying to use all of their terminology, well, he was injured and then he was captured and then, this and this and this happened to him because of his trauma from war, and they will say something along that line, but meaning physical things that happened to him,
right,
he can no longer think clearly. And so I don't want to make the leap like so many people do, and back diagnose that as PTSD.
right,
But certainly something has happened to an individual in that case that they can't explain, but they are telling us it's a mental health issue and has something to do with what has happened to him on the battlefield or in post battlefield,
right,
um, in while being tortured or whatever happened to him.
right,
And but I think I can say that that's some sort of trauma.
right.
Uh,
Well,
so
and
I'm using our modern terms, but at the same time, very cautiously.
preciously. Well, I mean, you have written several things, including an edited collection on trauma for our series, Explorations in Medieval Culture, which, by the way, Wendy is on the board of that series, and has done amazing work on trauma. In fact, we are in the process of starting another collection on trauma because there's so much to say about it. And of course, interdisciplinary examinations of records and literature and archaeology in terms of trauma, it's important to really look at what medieval people experienced as trauma, thought of trauma, because they did. I mean, the word trauma does
It,
exist. It is
yes,
certainly a
it does.
concept that existed at the time. And that's not projecting backwards to say this is a traumatic event. And we do have references to certain things that look like trauma that we recognize in literary sources, in medical sources, in legal sources. So,
Oh,
do you want to talk a bit more about kind of the broader aspect of trauma in medieval society?
well, it comes from a Greek word. So let's just start there. It's an ancient word. And most of the time, I would say up until the 20th century, I'm gonna go there. Um, most of the time, until we get to Freud, really.
Right.
Um,
Freud.
they meant, and we mean body trauma, trauma to our physical self. But can we look back and identify traumatic events? Yes. Are there traumatic events that then affect a society, a community, an individual? Yes, and yes, and yes. And so when a young lady is attacked and raped, and in the court records they say she suffered trauma, they mean the rape. But the fact that then she develops a mental health condition post that has nothing to do with that. So, what's happening there, except that she is suffering some kind of trauma. And and so some of these cases are not only should come with a warning, and I have cried in the archive more than once, I should say. So I'm translating along very slowly, and then I'll realize what I've just read. And some of them, like that case, are startling. They're horrifying. And these are people. It's not, it may have happened a really long time ago, but they are still human beings and they still suffered. And she clearly suffered. And they were going after the guy and is somebody who had helped him. That's awful. But um, in any case, but you see the trauma there, even if it isn't identified as a mental health trauma, the way Freud forward discuss trauma. But communities, whole communities might suffer trauma, and that's why they put up memorials.
Right.
And they did in the Middle Ages. It was very common. It's not just a cross at on a crossroad. Um, there were memorials to all kinds of things, events that had happened, whether it was um, a fire that burned down their church, or um, you know, uh, something that came and wiped out all their cattle and the cash crop, and something along that line. And there was a cattle plague that went through.
Or the plague itself. I mean, the 14th century instances of plague where entire villages might be wiped out. And I'm thinking of course, Edward the First and his dedicatory crosses for Eleanor wherever they laid her bier. I mean, that is a memorial to, I mean, Edward the First was an arsehole on so many levels, but he deeply loved his wife. And when she dies, every place where her bier rests on the journey for her burial, he had a cross erected, and that's a memorial to the trauma of her loss.
Yeah.
And a lot of people go, oh, that's kind of sweet, but that is a form of trauma too.
Well, and it's so when the bier, the coffin was sit down, um, people came to see it and collectively cried. In part because she was so generous and so kind. She was the good side of him. He had all the bad stuff, and she was, if you think about the royals being kind, it was her. She's
Right.
like, she gave to the poor. She made sure people, um, that mothers had care. Even some of the women of these soldiers ended up with some alms money, if not a cordy, from her influence, right?
So as I discussed with Dr. Rachel Swallow, because we talked about Edward and Eleanor at length, she though She was the kind side of him, but she is also implicated in his expulsion of the Jews from England because she profited from that expulsion.
Okay, that's bad.
Yes,
But
that was bad. But as
um,
I mean, as far as the English nobles went, and she was much loved of the English population, and the
they
stories of her
shared,
generosity.
so when they would put the coffin down and people gathered to see it, maybe even touch it, um, that's a collective way of mourning someone. And it doesn't have to be her. It's the point is that they're collectively doing that. And that's why the cross ends up there, because that's where they had collectively sobbed for this person. And that's a way of remembering the sobbing, but also remembering the loss. Like I want to remember the good times and maybe remember the bad times.
That's where you get the idea, particularly in the later Middle Ages, is the memento mori. It's the reminders of death, and the idea, as I am now, so you will be. And this that really takes up in the end after the plague in the 14th century. You really see a lot more references and physical markers of the memento mori because of this reminder of death. But it's not always sorrow. It's
No.
not always lamentation. Sometimes it's that celebration of, yes, well, we have life, let's not waste it, sort of thing. But I know in a lot of literary sources, they refer to people being lovesick, sycamore, love. I mean, we get that in Chaucer and the Knight's Tale when Arcita's pining away for the woman he's never spoken to and who basically doesn't know he exists. But that is also a variation of a mental state that gets really detailed description in Chaucer, where they're talking about that 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 depression. I mean, there's no other way to describe what Arcita is dealing with. I mean, it's not based on an awful lot, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So medieval people understood that sense of loss and the potential for debilitating mental illness or conditions that might just put them in a state where they couldn't do anything, where they're just going to sit under a tree and sob. And that might be exaggerated, but the literary sources that seem fictional still also provide some insight into how medieval people thought of these things. Yes?
Oh yeah, definitely. And there's certainly lots of descriptions of all different kinds of mental health, but in literature, mental health is typically, if it's not love sickness, which is its own little category, we'll put that over here for a second. Um, it's typically tied to a sin. And so if you are dissing the church or a representative of God in some other way, mental health, like verbally, it's that census thing. If you verbally, um, said bad things about the church, God, or his representative, then you're going to have a mental health problem because he's just going to say, okay, you don't deserve to think. Boom. And they often sometimes people with in stories would then have that mental health condition for some period of time, and then they would repent and then they would die, something like that. But some of them repent and go on to be okay. The biblical story of Nebuchadnezzar comes to mind. But there are other instances and other stories in the ecclesiastical literature that explain that kind of thing.
The one of the last questions I want to ask you is, as you said, the way that medieval cases adjudicated guilt, recognizing that they wanted accountability, they weren't saying you weren't guilty. They just said you had a reason for it, and we're going to accept that reason as long as you are repentant. Social justice movements now do that. What do you think the modern world can learn from the research that you do? What important things does the modern world, this current modern world in this political moment, need to learn from the Middle Ages when it comes to mental health, when it comes to trauma, when it comes to disability?
Well, I would say some of the key points is no one was left behind. People were integrated into society regularly. And as much as possible, they were included. Certainly, I don't want to downplay the fact that they were discriminatory, name calling. Some people were disinherited through will writing. I don't want anyone that has a mental health problem to ever set foot on my property again. Um, and so I think some parents or other relatives had had enough. It's it's certainly a disease of the family if we're talking about mental health, but disabilities generally, that some people were remarkable. Um, it's not just someone who was paraded out as here's a token person who has a physical disability, but there's one young man who fell in a pig pen at about 3 years old, and his hands and feet were chewed off by the pigs before they rescued him. I know, it sounds horrible. I'm sorry. He became a tailor. And you might say, how on earth is that possible? He learned to sew with his mouth, to hold the needle, to thread the needle. I know. He was really good with the pincushion. Um, but he also, used his legs to hold the fabric and smooth things out. And um, he became, people are remarkable. People can do whatever they want to do in the world. And I don't think we challenge people enough. And at the same time, we sell a lot of people short. And um, and I think there was a lot more. The Middle Ages is not just difficult, it was a period in which the brain was, only starting to be understood. And so if you had a physical disability, but you could think, they would, you know, there were people that became accountants that had no, were quadriplegic. There were people who did all kinds of things because they needed to make themselves useful. And why not use the brain? You still have that. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't name calling or
Right.
mudslinging or, just like today, people are people. And I would say a lot of things we can learn about the legal system. Um, is it's not just, is somebody non compos mentis and they can't stand trial, but that there is something in knowing so and so is guilty and then offering the forgiveness, the
Right.
pardon, the
Is
there
is the
it's
accountability
cathartic.
again? It's taking the responsibility for their actions and being accountable. And I was going to say about the way that society in the Middle Ages needed people, needed and were willing to make sure that people could function. When I spoke to Dr. Derek Newman Still, that was one of the things we discussed is the fact that modern society now makes things more difficult for people who have disability because we function on an ableist model of, well, we don't think about what people who are differently able need. Doesn't occur to us because we don't need it, so we don't do it. And that in the Middle Ages, it might have been different simply because they would do what they needed to make sure those people could work and could function in society. We don't do that. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I mean, other than putting in, say, wheelchair ramps, that's one part of the population. Disabilities come in many forms, and
Yes.
we have not really wrapped our head around body difference, um, and mental difference,
Sight, hearing
speed,
difference.
time shifting. Um, and certainly lots of people need extra time, and they're perfectly capable of getting it done if they had, a little more time. And so I think we should be better. We should, step up and say, okay, if they can do it in the Middle Ages, we should be able to do it now. Um, and certainly they were quite clever at doing lots of things, and I'm not going to sell us short and say technology doesn't make my life lots easier, um, because it does. I wouldn't want to live in the Middle Ages. Um, Especially, I mean, I've talked about wheeled vehicles and carts and
Apparatuses. Yeah.
things for people. But remember, they don't have paved roads. There might have been a few that had cobbles. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? It's not going to be a gentle, easy life. This is
No.
going to be difficult, no matter what you do. And those few people that, the guy who became a tailor or an accountant, they probably had a family member who did that and just, from a young age said, "Well, see what you can do." And of course, they became and maybe worked alongside somebody else who could do those things. But that doesn't mean they didn't do that.
Right. And the important thing to remember is that what modern society needs to be better at is providing a support system so that people can reach their potential, no matter what it is.
Right.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Turner, for joining me today and talking about all of the things. And we will certainly have you back at some point for a discussion on murder. Like I said, that may have to be a panel discussion on a lot of people with murder.
There's a lot of people working on murder.
Lots of people working on murder. But I want to thank you so much for talking to us today about mental health and trauma and physical health and the aspects of societal support in the Middle Ages.
Thanks so much for having me.
It was my pleasure. It was really, 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 really my pleasure. And I am Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.